fake news media said, Roger Stone will be charged with treason. Roger Stone will be charged with conspiracy against the United States. Roger Stone will prove to be the link between Russia and the Trump campaign. They could find no evidence of any of those things.
Who is Roger Stone?
They call me a dirty trickster. Patrick, I have never proclaimed myself that or called myself that. But if I am one, that means I can spot one. And the Russian collusion hoax is the greatest single political dirty trick in American politics. It's not easy to be Donald Trump. He got to the presidency owing nobody. He's been put in the right place at the right time for a reason.
Let's say he doesn't pardon you. What do you do?
I'm very concerned about this big government intrusion. The government's spying on us. It's keeping metadata information. Now they're tracking us through our cell phones to see if we're exposed to the virus. Is that really the reason they're tracking us? The story of Nixon is a story of resilience. And that's why I have a tattoo of him on my back. The voters can spot a phony a mile away. Bill Clinton is a psychopath. Lyndon Johnson is the personification of evil. I'm prepared to do anything to elect my candidate short of breaking the law.
Yeah, but you're cutthroat, meaning you had no sympathy for beating everybody. I mean, you're a hyper.
I think that's unfair. I'm an equal opportunity truth teller. They don't want to hear the truth. Or as Jack Nicholson said, they can't handle the truth.
Did you ever think you would make it? I feel I'm so close I could taste sweet victory. I know this life meant for me. Yeah, why would you bet on Goliath when we got Bet David? Valuetainment, giving values contagious. This world of entrepreneurs, we get no value to haters. How they run, homie, look what I become. I'm the one.
My guest today may be the most consistent, controversial figure of politics in the last 4 decades, and that's Roger Stone. This is a man that's worked on the campaign of Richard Nixon, George Bush. We got Ronald Reagan, as well as President Donald Trump. We got a lot to cover with him here today. So Roger Stone, thank you so much for being a guest on Valuetainment.
Patrick, I'm really honored to be here. And after 16 months of being unconstitutionally gagged by a federal judge, let's just say I have a lot to say. So I really welcome the opportunity.
Glad to hear that. So, Roger, a question for you before we get into all these different topics that we can get into. Obviously, there's a lot of different issues going on today. I want to hear your thoughts about where you're at. But there's one thing you say where you say there's 4 stages of fame, which is who is Roger Stone, get me Roger Stone, get me a Roger Stone type, and then who is Roger Stone? So 1, what does that mean? And 2, who is Roger Stone?
Well, that's the cycle of a career, whether you're in broadcasting or sports or entertainment or business. When you begin, of course, you're not well known. When you accomplish things, you are well known and people want your talents. After you're no longer in the game, people want somebody just like you. And then over time, people forget entirely who you were and whether you left a mark on this world. My goal was to leave a mark on this world. I have spent 4 decades fighting for the things that I believe in, and that is constitutional liberty, the U.S. Constitution, maximum personal freedom, small government, a strong national defense, and the United States of America. And you take a lot of slings and arrows. People have to remember that when someone wins an election, that means someone loses an election. And the person who loses the election is never happy about it. Sometimes they are even vindictive. So, I have no apologies to make. I've spent 4 decades in the rough and tumble of American politics, and I called them as I saw them. And although I am a Republican, I really believe that the Republican-Democrat divide is a Hegelian device that's just used to divide us. The real divide in America is between the insiders who have run things for 30 years and an outsider, in this case, Donald Trump, someone who comes to Washington and completely threatens to upset the status quo, who halts the country's blunting over the cliff to globalism, which is why the two-party duopoly, the political establishment in Washington, has been so anxious to get rid of this man, because he threatens their cozy little relationships. He threatens the way they have lined their pockets at the cost of the American people. So, I have nothing to apologize for. Politics ain't beanbag, as they say. And I've given as well as I've gotten. But there's one thing I do object to. I keep reading in every article about me over the last year, self-described dirty trickster Roger Stone, or self-proclaimed dirty trickster Roger Stone, or as CNN said the other day, Roger Stone, who has proclaimed himself the dirty trickster of American politics. Patrick, I have never proclaimed myself that or called myself that. I have pointed out that others have called me that. I've said that I'm consigned to the fact that it'll be in my obit, probably on my gravestone, but I have not engaged in any activity that isn't the same as the activities of my contemporaries. And most specifically, I'm prepared to do anything to elect my candidate short of breaking the law. That I haven't done.
So, but the question I want to ask is, who is Roger Stone? So, for example, if I was in I know the stories about in high school when, you were looking at the election and John F. Kennedy was running, and, you're looking at the two and you're going out there saying, I think they're going to make school day on Saturday. And you already knew how to get people to be convinced on different sides. But if I'm in high school with you and you're not 17, 18, I'm talking to the 14-year-old Roger Stone. Who was the 14-year-old Roger Stone?
Well, let's see, the 14-year-old Roger Stone was someone who lived in a rural area where there were no children my age within 25 or 30 miles. You know what that means, Patrick? No basketball, no baseball, no football. No team sport becomes available to you. So now you're relegated to sports that you can do by yourself, like long distance running or weightlifting. It makes you more of a loner, I guess. I'm the oldest of three children. My sisters are much younger than I am. I was the president of my class and the president of the student body in my high school 2 years in a row, having been elected as a junior and also elected as a senior. Unprecedented. I started studying how to get people to vote the way I wanted them to as a psychological experiment very early. I'm a Roman Catholic. I got all my sacraments in the church. I don't believe every iota of Roman Catholic dogma, but I very recently reaffirmed my belief in Christ. It's helped me enormously get through this ordeal in which the full weight of the federal government is placed on you in an effort to get you to do something dishonest. In my case, testify falsely against the President of the United States. It takes enormous fortitude to refuse. They hold out a path that would take all the pressure off of you, that would relieve all your personal and financial and family stress. And I simply said no. And I had to pray to God for support in that decision. I realize this is not a religious program, and I'm not trying to proselytize, but I am trying to answer your question about who I am. I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm a great-grandfather. I found great solace in the support of my family during this entire ordeal. My wife, Nidia, who's suffering from rheumatoid arthritis, has completely supported my decision to plead not guilty, to not roll over on the president, even though she knows our path might have been easier had we done so. She's been behind me 100%. And she suffered through the late nights of anxiety and the panic attacks and the other things that people don't see. But I'll never quit fighting. I'm not a quitter. People ask me about my reverence for Richard Nixon, who I met as a very young man and who was really my mentor in American politics. Now, there is no question that Nixon made some egregious mistakes, but he also accomplished some very great things. He was a peacemaker. He got a strategic arms limitation agreement with the Soviets, opened the door to China, ended the war in Vietnam, desegregated the public schools, saved Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Many great accomplishments, but that's not really why I revere him. I revere him because he was indestructible, because he got knocked down again and again and again. And as I think it was Vince Lombardi who said, it's not how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get up. The story of Nixon is a story of resilience. It's a story of persistence. It's an American story. And that's why I have a tattoo of him on my back. It's not a political statement. It's not a joke. It's a daily reminder that in life, particularly when you're handed nothing, that you have to just keep fighting for what you believe in.
So the question back in high school is, were you the guy bullying or were you the guy that was bullied? Which one were you?
I was more the guy who was bullied because I had no aptitude for sports. I wasn't among the jock set. And because I wasn't a pothead, I wasn't among the hippie contingent, which was just on the rise when I was in high school. So I had to appeal to both groups for votes. I had a pretty successful high school political career. It's interesting that the New Yorker magazine wrote a long piece about my high school years, never once bothering to interview me. I won my election as a student body president 981 to 61, but somehow the people at the New Yorker managed to find the 61 people. They couldn't find the 981 that voted for me.
So you were the one that was bullied?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I would be tormented on the school bus because I was carrying political books and interested in topics that no one else cared about. The 1968 election took place when I was in high school. And I was a very big supporter of the comeback of Richard Nixon. Nobody else in my class cared about the election. They were all interested in sports or girls or cars or all these other things. But I was interested in politics.
It's not, for somebody to take it to the levels that you took it, where you don't take, one of your rules is, your 10 rules is what? You're saying the fact that, attack, never defend, always be on the offensive, all these things that you talk about with your 10 rules, we'll get into that here in a minute, is for somebody to be that chippy and to have that kind of a drive to go beat the opponent, whatever it takes, in the most creative way, there has to be an event that really moved you as an individual. Was it an event that really pissed you off and you said, I'm going to prove a point? Was there a woman that left you, public humiliation, a loss, an ass whooping? Was there anything like that that happened that created a fire in you? Or was it just, this is how you were born from day one?
Well, I guess I had some resentment of the fact that my parents didn't make it through high school. They were very hardworking religious people. We were lower middle class, not upper middle class. I saw the privileged kids in my school whose parents gave them clothes and cars and nice vacations. So yeah, I had some resentment, and that resentment drives you. It drives you to succeed. It drives you to demonstrate that you are as good or as better. It means you have to work harder. It means you have to be more dedicated. But we did that. My father was a well digger. That's what he did for a living. He and his brother ran a company where it was a rural area. So if you owned a home, you had to drill your own artesian well and put in your own pumping system if you wanted to have drinking water or water to bathe with or cook with. And he ran an old-fashioned chop drill, where essentially a metal bit hits the ground over and over and over again. He would leave for work every morning about 5:36. He would come home at the end of the day around 6, completely covered with mud, just caked with mud. My mother would hose him down in the backyard, then she would serve him dinner, and then he would go to bed, and he would wake up the next morning and do the exact same thing. Every day, 6 days a week. Sunday, we went to church, and he took the afternoon off. Patrick, I never heard him complain. Not once did I hear him complain. But I can tell you this. When I introduced him to Ronald Reagan in Norwalk, Connecticut, and said, Governor Reagan, this is my dad, I could not have seen my father be prouder of me and everything I had accomplished. In his own way, he was a great man, a simple man, a man who believed deeply in his Catholic faith, a man who believed very much in thrift and hard work, but a man who gave everything so that his children could be educated and have a better life.
That's very interesting when you're telling that story about where you were at. So now, privileged kids. So you're growing up around privileged kids. Typically, when somebody is raised around privileged kids and you experience some of that anger, my dad worked at a 99-cent store. So I relate the fact that, you know, when your dad works at a 99-cent store in Inglewood, your parents get a divorce, you kind of got a little bit of a chip on your shoulder. But typically when you're around others that are privileged, wouldn't you become a Democrat instead of a Republican? What caused you to want to become a Republican over being a Democrat?
When I was 11 years old, just before I turned 12, the woman who lived next door to us, who was wealthier than we were, but a very nice lady, gave me a copy of a book called Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. And until that time, I had aspired to be an actor. What I wanted to be was an actor. And my parents, of course, kept saying, no, son, you need to learn a trade. You should be a plumber or an electrician or, you know, or a carpenter. Those people make really good money. And I said, no, I want to be an actor. I want to be on Broadway. I want to be in films. I want to be on television. They realized that had I tried that, I would have starved to death. But once I read this book, I was transfixed. I now knew exactly what I believed in. It was the first time I'd seen anybody codify the things that I felt, that we needed a strong national defense, that we needed to limit the size and cost of government, that we needed maximum personal freedom, that communism was inherently evil, and that it was a real danger to our society, that this was the greatest country on the face of the planet, and that the people who founded it had undergone extraordinary hardships to build the union that we enjoy today. And I knew at that point that I wanted to be in politics. There was a brief period of time when I thought about being a candidate, but I'm really not the extrovert that I try hard to be. I'm actually somewhat more introverted, and therefore I became more interested in the mechanics of politics, of the back room of politics, of how to get people to, you know, to legitimately, of course, vote the way you want them to, the use of sophisticated polling data and advertising techniques and messaging and that end of politics. And then I figured out that politics was really show business for ugly people. And I never looked back.
Show business for ugly people. But by the way, you talked about earlier when you were talking about Trump, you mentioned the fact that insiders and outsiders, and you said, here's a Trump that's coming up from an outsider wanting to compete with a bunch of insiders. But he got somebody like you to help him out. Wouldn't you be like the capital insider to get? Because if there's anybody that's an insider, it's you. Wouldn't that be the case when he hired you?
I don't think so. I mean, first of all, I think we have to have the context. I met Donald Trump when I was working for Governor Ronald Reagan in 1979, preparing for the 1980 election. I was assigned New York State, as well as New Jersey and Connecticut. For Ronald Reagan in 1980, those were very tough states. The rap on Reagan was, you know, he's another Goldwater. He's an extremist. The party would get decimated if we nominated him. We need someone more moderate or maybe even someone more liberal. The Republican establishment in New York State was supporting George H.W. Bush, a guy who couldn't figure out whether he was from Connecticut or Texas. The cowboy boots and the pork rinds didn't fool anybody. You grew up in Greenwich, dude. Be who you are. I worked for Tom Kean, the governor of New Jersey. He was the ultimate WASP. He had a strange accent. He had strange mannerisms, but he never tried to be something he wasn't, and people loved him because he was genuine. We've elected patricians in this country. The working people voted for Franklin Roosevelt. How more patrician could you get? It's the politician who tries to be something they're not that the voters can see through immediately. This is what I love so much about Trump. What you see is what you get. He's unscripted. He's unmanaged. He is unhandled. He is uncontrolled. He owes nobody. He got to the presidency owing nobody, no special interests, not Wall Street, not the banks, not the insurance companies, not the defense industry. He got to the White House owing only the American people. And therefore, he's completely unrestrained in what he can do. He owes no special interest. And he's extraordinarily independent. I mean, no one tells him what to think, what to say, where to go, who to appoint, what to do. And I think the American people find that refreshing. He's also not politically correct. So he may not be eloquent, but he's always articulate. You always know exactly where he stands, which is why as early as 1988, I began thinking of him as a presidential candidate. I was right in my assumption that over time, that the country would tire of career politicians from both parties who promise great things at election time and then never deliver them. We had Clinton, Bush, Obama. They were all going to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq, and they're still there. It's like changing the pins on the soiled diaper of a baby, but leaving the diapers in place. Nothing really changes. The rhetoric at election time, say between Romney and Obama, they tried very hard to sound different, but when you get right down to it, other than maybe in the area of tax policy, what they were offering you was exactly the same. I knew with Donald Trump it would be different, that he wanted to take the country in a completely different direction. I know this because I've known him for 40 years. He didn't run because he needed to be president. He didn't run because he wanted the pomp and circumstance or the prestige or the name ID or the beautiful house or the great plane. He ran because he saw the country being run into the ditch and he got tired of it. The one thing in business that he hates more than anything else is waste and being taken advantage of. And he saw America wasting money and being taken advantage of around the globe. And the point finally came where he had to do something for us, for his country, not for himself. He's lost billions in this job. And he has to suffer the daily vituperation and the tsunami of hate and false accusations against him and his family every single day, which would fell a lesser man, but who just gets right back up and gets right back in their face and keeps fighting. So he's a person of enormous courage. He's also, and I can tell you this firsthand, I worked for Richard Nixon. I worked for Senator Bob Dole, who, by the way, is a great American patriot. They're both very tough guys, but Donald Trump is tougher than either one of them. He's actually the toughest individual I've ever dealt with. When he believes in something, when he sets his mind on something, there is no limit to his drive to accomplish it.
Who comes second to his level of drive that you work with? You work with a lot of different personalities: Bob Dole, Nixon, Reagan, Kemp. The list is a long list. Who comes close to him?
Well, it's very hard. I think my answer might surprise you. Senator Arlen Specter. You know why? Because he lost a race for mayor, district attorney, governor, and U.S. Senate before he finally won a race for the U.S. Senate. That's drive. That's drive.
So would you consider yourself almost, just to kind of get an idea, and I'm not talking about the lobbying side of it, we'll get to that here in a minute, but do you see yourself somebody as, like in Hollywood, there's a manager that has talent that they represent, or in the NBA, NFL, there's agents and managers that represent a certain talent. Are you somebody that you sit there and you actually look at people and say, that guy can be a president one day. That guy has what it takes. I think she's got it. I think he's got it. Is that how you look at people when you see talent?
I think that's true. Yes, I think I can assess political talent, which, is a combination in the television age, in the mass media age of charisma, of ability to communicate, the ability to talk, as you know, in short, understandable sound bites. The most dangerous thing in politics is not being wrong. The most dangerous thing in politics is being boring. When a candidate for public office is boring, when they really have nothing to say, when they play it safe and they just keep producing platitudes for the American people, Voters view politics like they view entertainment. Boy, this show is boring. I think I'll turn the channel. They turn you off and they start to look elsewhere. There's nothing more dangerous in politics than trying to ride out the clock. When you're in an election going into the home stretch and you're ahead by, say, 5 points, and therefore you decide in the closing days to say nothing controversial, to not rock the boat. When you're sitting still in politics, you're losing. You're only gaining when you are moving. And moving means taking risks, expressing ideas, being out there on the cutting edge, and entertaining the voters and engaging them in a way in which they see something interesting in your candidacy.
So are you saying if Romney would have hired you, he would have been president?
Well, that guy was so phony, I'm not sure even I could have elected him. I mean, he was in 3 debates and he was 3 different guys 3 different times. As I said earlier, the voters can spot a phony a mile away. A guy who says, I'm severely conservative, no conservative would ever describe themselves that way. Mitt was not a conservative. Mitt didn't even become a Republican until he decided to run for the US Senate against Ted Kennedy. And in that race, he ran to Kennedy's left on everything. You wouldn't think there'd be any room to Ted Kennedy's left. Then he came back to run for governor, and he ran again as a liberal Republican. And then when he decided he wanted to become president, he started calling himself a conservative. But there's a long family tradition here. Recognize his father, Governor George Romney of Michigan. He knifed Barry Goldwater in the back, just the same way Mitt Romney knifed Donald Trump in the back. People need to understand the background here. Romney decided to run for the US Senate in Utah, a state that he does not live in. I think he owns property there, but he lives in Massachusetts, or he did then. Sure, there's a long Romney family tradition in Utah, but the state treasurer, a Republican, Trump supporter, very popular, he wanted to run for the Senate. So Mitt Romney prevailed on President Trump to muscle the state treasurer out of the race and endorse Mitt Romney for the Senate, all of which the president did in a gesture of peacemaking, for which Mitt Romney turned around and stabbed him right in the back. Mitt.
I remember that when that took place, by the way. So just out of curiosity, would you compare a Romney and the way he campaigned to how Kerry campaigned, 2 decades ago? Kind of some of their challenges, because there was a little bit of the flip-flopping and whatever I could say to win an audience over.
Well, the problem, of course, is that neither one of them could relate to the common man. I mean, the great thing about Trump is while he may be a billionaire, he can relate to the common person. He can relate to the cab driver and the bricklayer and the waitress in the diner, because he speaks colloquial English. He talks the way people talk. I mean, there's a famous story about John Kerry going into a Boston bar and saying, around for the house. And of course, all the working men cheer. And then he says, and I'll have a Cavassier and a snifter. It's a perfect example of the elitism of both Mitt Romney. I mean, Mitt Romney never had the same hair color in any of the debates. There's just nothing genuine about him. He's a guy reading a script written by other people, whereas Donald Trump doesn't have a script.
Yeah.
There's no 28-year-old speechwriter somewhere saying, here, Mr. President, here are your talking points. It's not how it works with Donald Trump. That's because he's not a politician. He's the leader of a political movement, but he's not a politician. He never really aspired to be a US Senator. He toyed with running for governor, and fortunately, he became convinced that Albany was too small for him, which it was. His destiny was to be right where he is. I think he was the right man at the right time to stop this country from hurtling over the cliff to globalism. I think he's not only was he the Republican who could beat Hillary Clinton, he was actually the only Republican who could beat Hillary Clinton. Why do I say that? If you look at Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, in those blue-collar, working-class Democratic precincts, he runs 5 to 7 points ahead of where Mitt Romney ran or where John McCain ran. He could win the votes of working class Democrat union member voters where they couldn't. Why? Because he's a regular guy. He's not a stiff. And those folks can spot a stiff a mile away. And he's also not a cranky old man like John McCain was.
It's so true. The fact that working men, they're around other working men, and their body language is what they're looking at. So they can see when they're looking at certain people on what to vote for and what not to vote for. You know, sometimes you watch the news and you watch times and you watch people's behavior, men's behavior change based on who the president is. When Clinton was president, you saw a lot of people take some of his style. When Obama was president, it was his style. When Bush was president, they took a little bit his. Reagan, Senior, it doesn't matter. Trump, you can go back and forth. In sports, you know, you look at someone and you'll say, you build a team around what position? In basketball, it changes sometimes. First, you need a center. Well, today it's not been a center league. It's been a more shooting guard league, or you need a point guard, all this other stuff. When you look at talent, they don't look the same. They don't talk the same. Reagan talks very different than Trump. Trump talks very different than Obama. Obama talks different than Bush, Bush Senior, you know, JFK, Nixon. You go and look at a lot of these candidates. What are some no matter what's you need for somebody to have the goodies to become the president of the United States?
It's a very hard thing to put your finger on. But in this age of mass communication, in the age of television, whether it's really now cable or satellite or broadcast TV, I think there's a certain charisma, a certain magnetism, a certain size. I don't mean physical size, although Donald Trump is very tall and very broad-shouldered. But in 1988, the first time I tried to convince Donald Trump to run for president, and he was, shall we say, mildly amused by my idea, I arranged for him to speak to the Chamber of Commerce in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a couple months before the New Hampshire primary. And we took his black helicopter from New York to New Hampshire. There were more people there to watch the helicopter landing than who'd shown up for Vice President George Bush at the same location about 2 weeks previously. I think it was a Chamber of Commerce. Lunch was sold out, so they had to set up speakers in outer rooms so more people could hear the speech. It was the largest crowd they'd ever had. And what did he talk about? Why are we getting ripped off by our allies in NATO? Why are we paying a disproportionate share for their defense? I could understand it after World War II when they were economically decimated and we were wealthy, but now our economy is struggling and they're wealthy. Why aren't they paying their fair share? If I were president, and I'm not running for president, folks, but if I were president, I'd make them pay their fair share. And this is pre-NAFTA. What about these trade deals? We are getting ripped off. They're really good for our trading partners, but they move all the jobs abroad. This is 1988, an amazing consistency. But more importantly, I saw the electricity of the crowd. I saw the way they reacted. They were stomping, waving their napkins. I mean, there was an energy in the room that you rarely see in politics, and this wasn't even technically a political speech. And I realized then that my instinct was correct, that Donald Trump could be president if a time would come that he wanted to be. But 1988, he still had real estate mountains to climb. He still had real estate projects he had not yet accomplished. The time was not right with the American people. They were still electing career politicians, expecting something different, but getting exactly the same thing. I wanted him to run again in 2000. The late Ross Perot, very well known there where you are in Dallas, and then governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura, who had a relationship with Donald Trump from his days wrestling at the Trump Casino at the Trump Plaza in Atlantic City, urged him to run to give the president all deference. I think, you know, he would tell you today, well, that was more Roger's idea than mine. I did my best to convince him. We made some exploratory efforts. He spent some money on polling, but he ultimately concluded correctly that one had to be either a Republican or a Democrat to be elected president, that the mechanism did not really exist for the election of a third party or an independent candidate, that you could not get into the national debates either by lawsuit or any other reasonable way. It's really a closed shop. And that he would have to be either a Republican or a Democrat if he ever ran. Then for 2 years, he would just needle me and say, I think I'll run as a Democrat, just because he knew I would go insane. And but it was a joke between us. And his parents were both, who I knew very well, great people. They were both hardcore Goldwater Republicans, Reagan Republicans. Donald was a registered Republican his whole life until he briefly shifted to the Independence Party in New York, which was the affiliate of the Reform Party, so that he would be technically eligible to run for the Reform nomination in 2000. The day after he decided not to run, he switched back to the Republican Party. And he was on the Ronald Reagan Finance Committee for New York State. That's how we met and how we became friends. So he's actually always politically been there. I remember when he was running for president, and many conservatives kept saying he's not a real conservative. Really, look at these judicial appointments. Look at these tax cuts. Look at these regulatory cuts. Look at the way he's rebuilt our military strength. I think his credentials have been more than proven.
So, when you're talking about President Trump, the Chamber of Commerce event that you set up, that he went up and he started talking about all these different things, it almost reminds me of the story of how Reagan, when he got hired by GE, I'm sure you've read this or you know about this, where he would go around giving speeches. They were paying him $1 million a year income, and he was supposed to talk about how special of a company GE is.
Yep.
And he couldn't help himself from talking about politics. And eventually they had to let him go because it was too much politics and it wasn't enough about what GE stood for. And it kind of it was, frustrating GE. Do you think a part of, again, I'm going back to seeing the foundation of somebody that you look at to say, this person's got what it takes to one day go run for it. Do you think it's a person that goes out there and does something where eventually they can become a president? If you look at a Nixon, he got the job done, became a president. If you look at a Reagan, if you look at a Bush, if you look at a Trump, each one of them had a different thing that led them to become a president. What would you say was each one of their strengths that helped them become a president?
Well, I think in Donald Trump's case, there's a couple of things. One, he had built a successful multi-billion-dollar business. Number two, largely because of The Apprentice, everybody in America knew who Donald Trump was. The greatest challenge for a presidential candidate, let's take Marco Rubio, for example.
Yeah.
I live in Florida. I know who he is. But let's go out on the street outside your studio and ask the first 7 people we see who Marco Rubio is, and they're going to tell you they have no idea. So in the stages of a presidential campaign, normally speaking, step 1 is to become well known. You can't tell people what you stand for if they don't even know who you are. Donald Trump had the ability to completely not have to go through that, because from day one, people knew he was the most successful entrepreneur in the country, if not the world. He already had a brand. He'd worked very hard to build that brand. Trump stood for success. Trump stood for quality. Trump stood for victory. Trump stood for integrity. In the real estate industry, everybody understood that a Trump building would be first class, that everything would be top of the line, whether it's the marble or the glass or the chrome or the design. It would always be the best. And even in the later years, when he would franchise his name, those agreements allowed him to control the quality of what was being built, so that his name would never go on anything that was substandard, even if he owned a minority piece of it. I think that was a very smart business thing, because he did not want to dilute the brand name, which stood for quality. The stature of having that high name ID, the courage to say exactly what you think, not to be a politician who sticks a wet finger in the wind to find out which way the wind is blowing in order to say things that will be popular. What can I say that will be popular, as opposed to Donald Trump, who says, I'm just going to tell you what I think. And voters, I think, found that refreshing. Trump was interested. People know he's unscripted. They know you never know what he might say. Let's tune in. This could be interesting. Whereas all these other candidates, particularly Hillary Clinton, everybody knew that every word coming out of her mouth had been polled and roundtabled and focus grouped and studied. It was completely phony. It was also, I think, in some cases, mistaken. When you denigrate your opponent's supporters as deplorables, and by the way, that was no mistake, that was a planned insult, you are alienating people who might, under some circumstance, consider voting for you. You can attack your opponent, but why would you attack the people voting for your opponent?
So that was Trump. How about the other candidates that you work with? Nixon, Bush, Reagan. What was their MO that helped them become presidents?
Reagan is, it's interesting because Donald Trump has some of the qualities of each of them. Like Ronald Reagan, Reagan was a big picture guy. Reagan was more than happy to leave the details of governing to his appointees. He focused on the big picture, whether it was no tax increases, whether it was rebuilding the military, whether it was taking a hard line against the Soviets. Remember, he inherited détente. And the underlying premise of détente under Richard Nixon and Dr. Kissinger was that we would never beat the Russians in the arms race, and therefore we had to find a way to coexist with them. The shift to Reagan is very dramatic. Reagan takes a new position. No, we will beat the Soviets. And our arms buildup required them to try to compete, which then collapsed their economy, and down came the wall. Reagan was very focused on the big picture. Trump is very much like that, very focused on the big picture. Nixon, however, has, Trump has Nixon's persistence, Nixon's stubbornness. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean it in the positive sense, that when he believes something, when he sets out to achieve something, he won't be deterred. And as I said earlier, Trump has much of Nixon's toughness in terms of, say, Dwight Eisenhower, who I think is really underrated as one of our greatest presidents because of his self-deprecation. In other words, he liked to kind of act like the bumbling old general who didn't really know what he was doing, but he was very smart and very in control of our government. And we had unprecedented peace and prosperity under Dwight Eisenhower. So Trump is shrewd like Eisenhower. He doesn't show all of his cards like Eisenhower. So I think he has many of the same qualities of those I consider our greatest presidents.
What would you say on the other side with Obama, with Clinton, and with Jimmy Carter? These are the last three presidents, or even John F. Kennedy. What were their strengths?
Well, John F. Kennedy, of course, if he were running today, would have to be a Republican because he was an ardent anti-communist. He wanted to return to either a gold or a silver-backed dollar. He was worried about an arms race with the Soviets. He wanted to get ahead of the Soviets. He was for strong national defense. People don't recognize this, but Kennedy won the 1960 election over Nixon by running to Nixon's right. The missile gap, Quemoy and Matsu and the Red Chinese menace, the threat of Castro only 90 miles off our shore, which he accused the Eisenhower-Nixon administration of not doing enough for. I think when Joe McCarthy went in the voting booth, he probably voted for Jack Kennedy, having dated Jack's sister, rather than his Senate colleague, Richard Nixon. So John Kennedy would have been, had he lived, one of our greatest presidents. Now, one of the great misnomers, of course, is that he did anything for civil rights. He did nothing for civil rights. He talked about it, he campaigned on it, he promised it, but his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, convinced him over and over again that it was too soon to have a Voting Rights Act. It was too soon to have an Open Housing Act. It was too soon to have an open, a voter protection system. And of course, as soon as Jack Kennedy was murdered, Lyndon Johnson did all those things that he had reserved for himself, going from a hardcore segregationist who as Senate president had killed every single piece of civil rights legislation other than the 1958 Civil Rights Bill, into which Johnson inserted a poison pill saying those indicted for civil rights crimes would be tried before state rather than federal juries. Well, no Mississippi or Louisiana or Georgia jury would convict a white man of a crime against a black man in 1960. So Lyndon Johnson, who was a segregationist and a hater his entire life, is now remembered as the civil rights president. How ironic. It is in the case of the other presidents you mentioned,
Obama.
Obama had enormous talent. It's very hard to understand how he came from nowhere to somewhere so quickly, how he went from being essentially a complete unknown. Then he gives an electrifying speech at the national convention, which makes him a national candidate. You got to remember the famous conversation recounted in Ted Kennedy's book, where Bill Clinton says to Ted Kennedy, this boy Obama, I don't know, Ted, a few years ago, he'd be carrying our bags and serving our coffee. Interesting. I think Obama was very talented in his ability to communicate. My own wife considered voting for him because he was promising us hope and change. He left us with neither, but very politically talented. Also very cool in a medium, in a television medium that requires that. Very effective, I think. Jimmy Carter, like Reagan in a way, in over his head, swallowed up immediately by the Washington establishment who really didn't want him to begin with. He won the nomination and the presidency completely based on an outsider strategy, based almost solely on the voters' revulsion over Watergate. But he got swallowed up immediately by Brzezinski and Cy Vance and all of these other establishment figures who essentially destroyed his presidency. He also was extraordinarily indecisive. And I don't think you could see that coming. When things in the country turned down, the economy was weak, we were being humiliated around the world, instead of taking action, he blamed the country. We have a national malaise, you may remember. By the way, he's the only former Democratic president who, when I met, treated me quite well. He was very warm, and I enjoyed the opportunity to talk to him. He was a complete gentleman. Bill Clinton is a psychopath. Read my book, The Clintons' War on Women. He's charming, he's a rogue, he's very convincing, but he's a serial assaulter of women. It is fully documented. I really think that he is a functioning psychopath.
Who do you dislike more, himself or LBJ?
Oh, Lyndon Johnson is the personification of evil. If you read my book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy,
Sure, yeah.
Case Against LBJ, which is still a New York Times bestseller, still does quite well. He was a sadist. He was a crook. He was an alcoholic. He was a pill popper. He was a womanizer. He enjoyed humiliating his staff. This is why he would conduct White House meetings while sitting on the toilet in order to embarrass and humiliate the Kennedy holdover Ivy League aides who were still serving on the White House staff. The purpose of this was not just his crudeness. The purpose was he did it because he could. He did it because he enjoyed the discomfort that it caused others. Anybody who wants to understand the psychopathic nature of Lyndon Johnson merely needs to read my book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. I'm not an attorney, but in that book, I use eyewitness evidence, fingerprint evidence, deep Texas politics, and a lot of insider knowledge, I think, to make a compelling case that Lyndon Johnson has the motive, means, and opportunity to kill John Kennedy, and his actions immediately after the assassination, while I admit they are circumstantial, certainly bolster that case.
Roger, when you look at everybody today, both on the left and the right, who do you see as candidates where you say those three have a shot in the next 20 years to be a president. These three have a shot in the next 20 years to be president. Is there anybody you see?
That's a very, very difficult question. There are a few people that I think are potentially promising. You know, it's very early. I like the idea, and some people will scoff, but I don't really care. If the president is reelected, and I think he will be in a very tough contest, then what I would like to see is for him to appoint Donald Trump Jr. as the infrastructure czar. Pay him $1 a year and let him take on the project of working with the stakeholders, the unions, municipalities, and states to rebuild our infrastructure. This is what Donald Trump Jr. does. He, like his father, is a builder. And if over 4 years he can prove himself in that job, he's got the family name, he's got the speaking ability, he's got the courage. He'll be the age Jack Kennedy was. He could be president. Now, that's a lot of ifs, but when it just comes down to talent and courage, I think he has those things. But there are others. You know, if I had to pick the person in the U.S. Senate whose politics most closely resemble mine, I would have to say that would be Senator Rand Paul. Now, in the television age, I think he himself would admit that he is not a candidate built for the television age. He's kind of rumpled and almost looks like a college professor in the way he dresses. He's far more interested in policy and principle than he is, you know, the whether his suit is pressed or not. But I like his politics. And had I not been for Donald Trump, who I had certainly an antecedent commitment to, I probably would have voted for Rand Paul as the person I most closely identified with, someone deeply suspicious of the erosion of our civil liberties and the fact that the government's spying on us. It's keeping metadata information on our emails, on our phone calls, on our text messages. Now they're tracking us through our cell phones to see if we're exposed to the virus, or is that really the reason they're tracking us? You're talking to somebody that the government had under surveillance for 3 years. They say 2 years, but the New York Times says 3 years. I have reason to believe 3 years is correct. So they gave me the full legal proctological examination. And as you know, for almost 2 years, CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the rest of the fake news media said, Roger Stone will be charged with treason. Roger Stone will be charged with conspiracy against the United States. Roger Stone will prove to be the link between Russia and the Trump campaign. Roger Stone will be charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, aiding and abetting a felony before the fact, cyber crimes, including unauthorized access to a protected computer, receipt and dissemination of stolen data. And after examining every corner of my life, my family life, my social life, my personal life, my political life, my business life, they could find no evidence of any of those things, which means they lied to several federal judges to get the warrants to violate my Fourth Amendment rights. I'm very concerned about this big government intrusion into the privacy rights of the average American. What happened to me, where in the flash of an eye, you can lose your voice, your ability to make a living, your home, your insurance, your savings, in the blink of an eye. If it can happen to me, believe me, Patrick, it can happen to you or any other American.
I saw a similar thing happen to Bernard Kerik as well when he was going through we've had Bernard Kerik on Valuetainment as well in the past before. It was interesting seeing him go through the process. By the way, from where you're at right now with your indictment, obviously all this stuff is public. Everybody's read about it, seen it. You know, it's not something that hasn't already been addressed. Where are you at with that? How are you feeling about how that's going along so far right now?
Well, I think there's a lot of misperceptions about my case for two reasons. One, there was at the time of my trial really pretty much of a media blackout. But the only thing that got a lot of coverage was my conviction. So if you ask the average person what it is that Stone was convicted of, they don't know. A lot of them will tell you, well, Russian collusion, which of course I was charged with lying to Congress, which is kind of laughable because Comey lied to Congress, Brennan lied to Congress, Clapper lied to Congress, Mueller lied to Congress, Rosenstein lied to Congress, McCabe lied to Congress, Page lied to Congress, Strzok lied to Congress, and the list goes on. But the difference is they lied about consequential things that were material. Misstatements that I made to Congress were completely immaterial. They didn't hide any underlying crime. This was a fabrication of Andrew Weissman, who made the mistake of leaving his initials on the meta tags on my original indictment. Very artful. But I didn't get a fair trial. First of all, the judge eliminated every powerful argument that I could make. I was not allowed to raise the question of the misconduct of the special counsel or the FBI or the Department of Justice or any member of Congress. We now see the FBI misconduct in the Flynn case. I can tell you that even though my case records are sealed and I cannot talk about it, the FBI's conduct in my case is every bit as shocking and egregious, but I was not permitted to raise that. I wasn't permitted to raise the misconduct of the special counsel, the threats that they leveled against my friends if they wouldn't testify the way they were told to. I was not allowed to argue selective prosecution, despite the fact that Mueller and all these others, Comey, et cetera, had lied to Congress, and I hadn't. I was not permitted to raise that defense. I wasn't permitted to prove, which I could have done with forensic evidence and expert testimony, that nobody hacked the DNC. The DNC was not the subject of an online hack. Now, if you read my indictment, the first 5 pages are based on that premise, but the judge denied me the right to disprove the underlying premise of my indictment. So it'd be like going into a prize fight with both hands tied behind your back. And then, of course, as we now know, and then the judge gagged me so that CNN and MSNBC could create a tsunami of disinformation and fake news about me and my case and so on. But I was not permitted to respond. That's to destroy your ability to make a living and your reputation. And then lastly, we learned after the trial that the jury forewoman had posted on Twitter and Facebook, not just attacks on Donald Trump, which by the way alone would not disqualify her, but attacks on me personally, starting on the day I was arrested and subsequently, and that she hid those during the period of jury selection. I believe she misled the court about them, and therefore I was not given, as the Supreme Court requires, a jury that was both impartial and indifferent. The only person in the world who thought differently was Judge Jackson in my case, who said the opposite in a decision. I have appealed that decision separately from the conviction, and I will win that appeal if I am still alive by the time it's heard.
Let's just say you get charged. Let's say hypothetically
I've been charged.
I mean, let's just say you have to do the time. Let's just say you're going through the process and President Trump, comes in. Do you think he will pardon you?
I really don't know. I can tell you this. I have not been promised a pardon. I have not been assured of a pardon. I have been encouraged by the things that he has said publicly, both on Twitter and on interviews. He knows I did not get a fair trial. He himself said it was a miscarriage of justice. And we now know why I was targeted. They knew by August of 2017 that there was no Russian collusion. So why were they investigating me after that date? The reason is very clear. They came to me or to my lawyers on July 24th of 2019, and they said, it's time for your client to come clean. It's time for your client to confess. He needs to think hard about the substance of these 29 phone calls between himself and Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign. And when he's ready to tell the truth, that they were really about Russia and WikiLeaks, well, then we might be willing to recommend to the judge that he serve no jail time. If, on the other hand, he isn't prepared to, their words, remember, we may issue a superseding indictment and hit him with more charges. And my answer was quick and easy. I said no. And my lawyer said, you understand how serious this is. They could add, any kind of additional charges. And in this case, no matter how fabricated, you'd probably be convicted. And I said, well, that's the way it is. I was not going to bear false witness against the president. I was not going to be the ham in their ham sandwich for the Mueller report. I was not going to be the false testimony on which they based an impeachment and removed somebody that I have not only deep affection for, but who I think even today is among our greatest presidents, taking on the two-party duopoly and the media. It's not easy to be Donald Trump, but his faith hasn't wavered. The hand of God is on him, let me assure you. He's been put in the right place at the right time for a reason. And I believe that reason will become clear to all of us by the end of his second term.
Roger, let's say he doesn't pardon you. What do you do? Are you okay with that if he doesn't pardon you?
Well, I'll have to pray to God for guidance in that case.
Oh, okay. So
a great deal. I would be a political prisoner.
Okay.
I think people would know that. I think there would be great anger among Trump supporters, not at the president, but because the Justice Department, in two cases, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice has recommended the criminal charges of James Comey, but Mr. Comey has not been charged. If at the end of the day, Mr. Clapper, Mr. Brennan, Susan Rice, Samantha Powers, this list goes on and on, Rod Rosenstein. By the way, if lying to Congress is a crime, I watched Rosenstein today. I found 13 things he lied about. So when is he being charged? I just asked that question. I think that many of the president's supporters will be upset about the two-tier justice in this country. If you are a Democrat and a supporter of Hillary Clinton, you can pull off an abuse of power that is far worse than what we saw in Watergate. I saw this windbag from Illinois, Richard Durbin, today, saying, instead of talking about the danger of this virus or poverty and the fact that our cities are engaged, we're here talking about a rehash. Then I went back and looked at what he had to say about Watergate when he was running for the U.S. Senate in 1972. And it was the worst constitutional crisis in the world. Let's be very clear. In Watergate, there was never any evidence whatsoever that the president of the United States knew about or approved the break-in at the Democratic National Committee. The Democratic National Committee was broken into by a small band of private citizens who were former intelligence operatives, but were in private life, and they planted bugs that never worked and never produced anything. In this case, the full authority of the United States government and the incredible intelligence committee's capability for surveillance and the court systems were legitimately used to spy on the Republican candidate for president, the president-elect, and the president of the United States. This makes Watergate look, as the president said the other day, like small potatoes. But to Senator Durbin, it's no big deal. It was a big deal when Nixon did it, although it wasn't, the crimes weren't nearly this egregious, but it's not a big deal today. Please, Senator, go back to Illinois. You're an embarrassment to the U.S. Senate. By the way, Senator Durbin suggested that I should be called before the committee to testify. Let me say right now, let's do it. I'm ready. You and I, Durbin, let's go head to head. I'd be happy to humiliate you.
That would never happen, though.
Of course not. They don't want to hear the truth. Or as Jack Nicholson said, they can't handle the truth.
What a movie. So when's the last time you spoke to Trump? Can you actually have conversations with President Trump or not at all?
No, because his lawyers will not allow it, and my lawyers will not allow it.
Okay, got it.
So I have to, like many, I have to read the president's feelings by watching his tweets and his public comments. We have many mutual friends, so I have every reason to believe that president still holds me in high regard. And look, I think he understands that I was targeted only because of my loyal support for him. And I was targeted long after they knew there was no Russian collusion to try to come up with some basis to try to impeach him.
Roger, with all the fairness,
I wouldn't do it.
If I may say this, with all the fairness, somebody may say there's a lot of other people that also sided with him, but they're not indicted. They're not going through what you're going through right now. So the opposition may say, you know, the argument of saying they don't like the fact that I just sided with them. That's why. But
no, I think it's closer than that. First of all, I exchanged the 39 calls that they refer to were telephone calls that lasted longer than a half an hour. That is not the total number of telephone calls between Donald Trump and myself during the 2016 campaign. So therefore, that creates an avenue to if we can get Stone to say what we want about these phone calls, we've got a witness against Trump, number one. Number two, when I wrote the book, The Clintons' War on Women, I think I aggravated the Clintonistas. The woman who headed my prosecution, Jeannie Rhee, represented the Clinton Foundation and Hillary Clinton in the missing email case. If that isn't a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. The pompous, bully, corrupt, dirty cop, Aaron Zelinsky, who then took over my prosecution, who committed many crimes, which will be a subject of formal complaints to DOJ and the bar in Maryland and DC. This guy was Hillary Clinton's deputy counsel at the State Department. Now, the media keeps describing them as non-political career prosecutors. That is not true. That is not who they are. Jonathan Kravis, the U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney who prosecuted me. He was the deputy counsel in the Obama White House. Abuse of power by him in previous cases is well known. His illegal abuses during the trial of 3 of Congressman Ron Paul's campaign aides is epic. His defrauding of the court in my case is a matter of public record for which he will ultimately have to answer. They want to fight, we will still fight, even if I have to do so from a prison cell. People who are giving to my legal defense fund at stonedefensefund.com are fueling my efforts to prove the truth. And I must tell you, Patrick, I thank 65,000 Americans who are praying for me, who are praying for my family, who are sending me the money that has sustained this fight, because I have been wiped out. I have nothing. I am literally indigent. I'll tell you what I have. I have the IRS knocking on my door, wanting back taxes at a time that they know I have literally nothing but the clothes on my back.
So let's just say President Trump is watching this and he knows there's pressure on him pardoning you, one, on the side of people who support you, and then also on the other side of if he does pardon you, he's going to get a lot of heat knowing re-elections coming up. And maybe Jared Kushner, who is a little bit more of a logical guy who doesn't necessarily have maybe the relationship that you have with Trump since 1988, maybe Jared whispers and says, this is not a good time to pardon. Maybe let's pardon in December or January or February. If they're watching this, are you okay with the pardoning not taking place anytime soon till 2021?
You know, one of the first things I learned in politics from Richard Nixon, don't answer hypothetical questions. Here's what I know. Donald Trump is a person of great fairness.
Okay.
He's a person of great mercy, and he knows what's happened here. But here's what I also know. Nobody tells Donald Trump what to do. Not Roger Stone, not Jared Kushner, certainly not Steve Bannon, nobody. And therefore, I believe that he will make the right decision at the right time. And I pray to God that will be sooner rather than later. But I'm not advocating anything other than justice, because I think it is abundantly clear. The president has noted several times that I did not get a fair trial. When the jury forewoman is attacking me in 2019, and then she erases those posts to cover her trail, no reasonable lawyer believes that is correctly decided. Jonathan Turley's not a conservative or a Republican. He said Stone is entitled to a new trial on that basis. In the Boston Marathon bombing case, the guy convicted got a new trial because one of his jurors was posting on social media on the topic of terrorism. Not even that case, just the topic of terrorism. My juror had not a single Trump supporter, not a single Republican, not a single military veteran, not a single blue-collar worker, not a single person with less than a college education, but a majority with post-college educations, 3 appointees from the Obama and Clinton administrations, several people who had personal relationships at the Department of Justice or the FBI. It was by no means a jury of my peers.
Knowing how he's wired, I wouldn't be surprised if he just decided to pardon you tomorrow, you know, after all the messes going on, to have the media go crazy about the fact that you're pardoned. But let's just say he does. If he pardons you, would you agree to get a tattoo of Donald Trump instead of Nixon on your back?
You know, I was thinking of doing, Patrick, in all honesty, to do it right. I thought I would add Trump, Goldwater, and Buckley to my back to have kind of a Mount Rushmore
Buckley
type thing.
Wow, Buckley on that list. He's one of a kind. They don't have too many Buckleys nowadays. So that means we should be expecting some new tattoos here soon. They say you can't just get one tattoo in life. Once you start one, there's a bunch that come afterwards.
Well, from your mouth to God's ear.
Mouth to God's ear. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of the dirty politics. All you hear about from the side of the people that are not in the world of politics, dirty politics. And it's very obvious. I mean, you know, you've done some very, some would call some nasty tricks, games, manipulation, whatever it may be. You've done some interesting things when it comes onto politics. Who do you think plays dirtier politics, the left or the right, Democrats or Republicans?
Well, you know, in 1960, the West Virginia primary became very pivotal for John F. Kennedy. So Robert Kennedy put together a piece of literature attacking Jack Kennedy's Roman Catholicism. He put Hubert Humphrey's disclaimer, paid for by Humphrey for president, and he mailed it to every Catholic household. What would you call that? I'd call that a dirty trick. Wouldn't you call that a dirty trick? And then in the Wisconsin primary, he would put out a mailing accusing Hubert Humphrey of being a draft dodger while Jack Kennedy was a war hero. The problem was that Humphrey volunteered for the service and he was turned down for physical reasons. Now, I'd call that a dirty trick. But I guess I'd say this. They call me a dirty trickster. I don't think I've done anything that's beyond the bounds of my contemporaries. But if I am one, that means I can spot one. And the Russian collusion hoax is the greatest single political dirty trick in American politics. It is the harnessing of the authority of the United States government and the capability of our intelligence agencies to spy on a political opponent. It's the use of the government, of the machinery for political purposes. It's sedition, it's treasonous, and it's highly illegal.
Would you consider yourself a hyper-competitive guy?
No question about it.
Okay,
I hate losing. It makes me puke.
So would you say anybody in the game is better at the game of politics and the tricks behind marketing, whatever it is, than you? Anybody in the game?
Well, I think the problem with politics is it looks easy from the outside. People, I think, don't really recognize that political strategy is a science, that you're not basing anything on your instincts or your feelings or even your own personal beliefs. You base campaign strategy on very sophisticated voter research surveys. That means polling. But the purpose of the polling is, I think, widely misunderstood by the public. It's not to find out who's ahead and who's behind. Those are actually the least important numbers. It's to find out what of your core messages move voters. What information is it that you can communicate to voters that will get them to vote for you and not your opponent, or to move from undecided to vote for you? Then the second question you have to answer is, what's the most efficient way to deliver this information? Let me give you an example. Joe Biden makes a great comeback in the Democratic nomination process in South Carolina because he gets an almost monolithic African-American vote. do those African-American voters realize that Joe Biden is the father of the legislation that has incarcerated more Black people for first-time nonviolent drug crimes than anybody in history? That the Biden bill, as he used to proudly call it, which mandated the absolutely mandatory harsh penalties for the first time nonviolent crime of possession of tiny amounts of drugs for personal use, is responsible for the mass incarceration at this point of millions of Black people who are trapped in our penal system with extraordinarily long sentences, which has destroyed lives, destroyed families, destroyed without any hope of rehabilitation. And if you're a conservative, it's costing taxpayers millions of dollars to house and feed and incarcerate people who are not a menace to society, people who are not inherently violent, people who haven't been convicted of a violent crime. Joe Biden, he's the father of this. He doesn't recant. He argued with a woman in New Hampshire about how successful this policy has been. The war on drugs was Richard Nixon's biggest single mistake. However, it's Bill Clinton and Joe Biden who turbocharged the war on drugs. Under Nixon, there were not mandatory penalties. A judge could take into consideration if the housewife who's caught with a small amount of marijuana in her purse, but has to work a day and a night job to support 3 kids, should get a different sentence than some gangbanger caught with a quarter ounce of cocaine. But today, a judge doesn't have that discretion, thanks to Joe Biden. Joe Biden, who started his career as an opponent of the desegregation of the Wilmington school system. That Joe Biden. Joe Biden, whose son, as Attorney General, refused to investigate the hangings of Black men all over Southern Delaware, saying that it wasn't racially motivated, when the evidence is to the contrary. So people need to know Joe Biden's real record. Why do I say this? Because I've seen polling and it moves people. Now, let's go to question 2. How do you impart that? Urban radio in this country is both inexpensive and has extraordinary reach to African-American voters. In every major swing state, Detroit, Milwaukee, Richmond, Charlotte, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, these voters are not difficult to reach, and the message that will get them to see the real Joe Biden. I was very happy to see the president tweet about this today. It is a major and legitimate issue. When Joe Biden says, I've always been a great advocate for civil rights, number one, he said he marched with Dr. King. That is a lie. He never marched with Dr. King, and he has race baited throughout his career when it benefited him.
So let me ask you this question, since you were a Barry Goldwater fan yourself and you read his book on conservatives. Is in 1960, 64% of African Americans voted for the Democratic Party. Again, in 1960, 64% voted for the Democratic Party. Fast forward 4 years later, 1964, 92% did. That means a lot of African Americans were conservative at one point, pre-Barry Goldwater.
Well,
Barry Goldwater somewhat changed that, right? And today we're at 88%.
Yes.
And by the way, I know you're a fan of Barry Goldwater, so I'm curious to know what you say about that. I'm asking this for a reason.
Let's take it from a larger context, if we may.
Let me finish the question, and then I want you to answer. Let me finish the question. You see where I'm going with this. The reason why I'm asking this is because, do you think what Barry Goldwater did to cause the Republicans to lose the African-American vote from 64%, which means 36% was open to voting Republican, African-Americans, to 92%. Today it's 88%. That's a big number. Charlemagne God says, you know, Democrats just have the African-American vote, right? And then you hear Joe Biden say, if you vote for Trump, you're not Black. My question for you would be, do you think what Barry Goldwater did to cause the Republicans lose a ton of African-American votes to Democrats, do you think Joe Biden could cause Democrats to lose a lot of votes to Republicans with what he just said?
If those voters, if today's Black voters get the real information, yes. Let me put it in a little broader context, if I may. Eisenhower gets about a third of the black vote. In 1932, more black Americans voted for Herbert Hoover than Franklin Roosevelt. The black vote in America was traditionally Republican. Why? Because of the Civil War. The Democratic Party was the party of segregation. The Republican Party was the party of emancipation. That changed during the New Deal for economic reasons, and a majority of black voters started voting Democratic, but still a solid third of them still voted Republican. In 1960, running against Jack Kennedy, Nixon still retained 32.5% of the African-American vote. Jackie Robinson was campaigning for Richard Nixon in 1960. In 1964, Barry Goldwater, who had personally desegregated the family department stores in Phoenix and who was a member of the NAACP in Phoenix, opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act because he said it violated the states' rights, that the states needed to desegregate, not the federal government. Therefore, he was depicted by a monolithic mainstream media as being anti-civil rights, despite his record in Phoenix, which was to the contrary. Now, Richard Nixon bears some responsibility here because in 1968, you have to remember, he has Humphrey running to his left and he has George Wallace running to his right. He cannot afford to lose votes to either one of them. So he basically, they all talk about the Southern strategy, that he essentially said civil rights laws need to be applied evenly. Busing in Boston is just as wrong as busing in South Carolina. Racism in the Boston school systems is just as egregious as the racism in the Southern school systems. Now, he gets elected. This is where it becomes important. Richard Nixon desegregated the public schools. At the time he became president, 17% of them were desegregated. Almost 82%, I guess, were still segregated. By the time he left office, that was about 7%. No violence, no bloodshed, desegregation. Richard Nixon gave us affirmative action. Affirmative action is not a Johnson or a Kennedy policy. Affirmative action is a Nixon policy, giving folks a leg up who had been discriminated against for centuries. I'm the last conservative that still defends affirmative action. Who tripled the funding for black colleges as president? Who appointed more African Americans to public office than LBJ and John Kennedy combined? Richard Nixon. Who increased by 90% the funding for civil rights law enforcement at the Justice Department? Richard Nixon. So I would say the record is more important than the rhetoric, but the rhetoric cost us a majority of the African American vote. Then there was no particular effort made by more recent Republican nominees, McCain, Romney. They offer no strategy for the cities. They offer no strategy for the improvement of lives of Black Americans. And then along comes Donald Trump, and in my opinion, a historic opportunity. You have a growing Black middle class. You had African American and all minority unemployment at the lowest point possible. What do African Americans want? I have a lot of African American friends. You know what they want? They want the same things I want. They want to live in a safe community. They want good schools for their kids. They want economic opportunity. They don't want to be employees. They want to be employers. They want a piece of the American pie. And I think the juxtaposition of Joe Biden's record of incarcerating Black people and Donald Trump's record through the Second Chance Act of freeing people who are unfairly trapped in our penal system for small, nonviolent crimes is a debate I want to have.
So let me ask you, based on that, your thoughts with the tragic event that took place with George Floyd and the cop, the Minnesota cop that led to the riots and protesting. And that goes back to Rodney King, March of '91. I came to the States November of 28 of 1990. Exactly 4 months later, I'm living in LA. Rodney King's event takes place, and then in '92, the riots take place. We're talking 28 years difference, and we're experiencing similar type of riots, if not worse. What do you think needs to happen for all of this to stop?
Well, first of all, I think the penalties against those 4 cops are not nearly severe enough. 3rd-degree murder? No. Much tougher. This cop absolutely knew what he was doing, and the look on his face indicated to me that he was enjoying it. So I'm not satisfied that justice has been visited. The case of the one officer who watched and did nothing, he needs to be prosecuted also. That's terrible, but it's not as bad as the 3 who actually engaged in what I believe was a murder. So justice hasn't been done there. I don't think the state has brought strong enough charges against those cops. But I also recognize that this event is being used to legitimize anarchy and violence that has nothing to do with the horrific murder of George Floyd. And that, I think, is wrong. I saw Floyd's family today appeal for peace, to appeal to people to abide by the law. I think that was a very courageous thing. Do I deny that there's still racism in our country? No, not whatsoever. And it has to be eradicated. But the best social program in the world is a good, steady job and upward mobility. The best thing we can do is give economic opportunity and equal educational and opportunity to all Americans. That's what I think Donald Trump is committed to. And that is what was working until these horrific events, which have the ability to change the entire political calculus.
How much do you think the playbook, the Rules for Radicals, the book, Saul Alinsky, how much you think that book is being played out nowadays? Do you think it's just a good book being written, or do you think it's actually being put to use today?
It's being put to use today. The pallets of bricks just happen to show up. Really? How about the buses to transfer all these people around from out of state? Who's paying for those? I did a show on a major cable network recently. And I was told by the producer, by the way, there's one name you can't mention. I said, who's that? You can't mention George Soros in any way while you're on, please. And of course, I honored their request because I was their guest. I won't mention the network. But I don't understand that. If somebody is paying for violence, if they are paying people who are advocating the violent assassination of the president on social media platforms, which is a crime, if somebody is paying for these attacks and this violence in our cities, those seems to me to be crimes. And I wonder where Attorney General Barr and his people are. Remember the great lesson of Watergate? I'm sure you remember it, because liberals said it over and over and over again. No person is above the law. No person is above the law. Would that not include Barack Obama and Joe Biden, who had full knowledge of the unconstitutional and seditious effort to remove Donald Trump based on completely fabricated information? It was fun to watch Rod Rosenstein try to run between the raindrops today, but he lied repeatedly about numerous things.
What do you expect President Obama to be talking about today? I think he's given a speech for the first time, while, he's not in office. He's given a speech today. What are you expecting him to talk about?
He'll talk about racial justice, much of which I'll probably agree with. I hope that he will seek to tamp down violence. Violence is never the answer. But beyond that, I'm not going to suggest what he might do. He's a man of enormous oratorical talent, and I'm sure he'll do a good job. But his message will be, the undercurrent of his message will be a criticism of President Trump. I think you can pretty much guarantee that. We used to have a tradition in this country that former presidents just did not criticize current presidents. Before he took any action in Cuba, Jack Kennedy called Dwight Eisenhower to ask his opinion, for example. And presidents have often consulted with their predecessors. They don't have to, but there was a certain comity. Yesterday, I saw George W. Bush put out, I guess it was a letter criticizing Donald Trump. This isn't surprising, George W. You and your entire family, who plundered the United States government, voted and endorsed Hillary Clinton. So why should we listen to you about anything?
You got to also realize that the opposite could be when he was asked, President Trump was asked, have you called Barack Obama to ask advice on anything? He says, no, I don't need to. I'm fine what I'm doing. So even President Trump didn't want to make that phone call to Trump. So some may say, Roger, I understand the point you're making with John F. Kennedy calling Ike, but at least even Trump is not calling Obama.
Well, but Ike hadn't authorized the illegal surveillance of John Kennedy.
Then that's a different story. Yeah. So, going back to what you're talking about here, when it comes down to the politics side, and people are going to this politics side, one of the things I'm always curious about when I look from the outside is, who are the power players? The whole puppet with some people are controlling it. Is it candidates that are the most powerful people? Is it the money backers? Is it the lobbyists? Is it the media? Is it former presidents? Roger, you've been in this game for a long time. Who are the most powerful people that get to control a lot of the decisions that are being made in politics?
Well, there's no question about the extraordinary power of the media. That power continuum shifted in 2016. It's only through the rise of a robust, vibrant alternative media based in the internet that Donald Trump is able to communicate around the national networks and around the established corporate-owned media directly to the people and get elected. That's why you see this systematic campaign of censorship on all media platforms, social media platforms, of Republicans and conservatives and libertarians and Christians and anyone really who isn't a liberal. It's a violation of the antitrust laws. The lawsuits that have been brought against Twitter and Facebook on First Amendment grounds have not fared well in the courts. But there are solid antitrust issues here, and all Attorney General Barr needs to do is initiate immediate antitrust action against Twitter and tell them, I'm sending marshals to shut your operation down unless you stop. He has that authority. It needs to be used.
Does he really have that authority?
They're clearly violating antitrust law. They have a monopoly, and they're protecting their monopoly.
Who has a monopoly?
The tactics that they have used to disadvantage competitors, like, say, Gab or Parler or Telegram, are easily findable. I sat in the room for the hearings of the House Judiciary Committee on Internet Censorship. And I watched the chairman of Google lie to Congress repeatedly under oath. Ironically, the crime that I'm charged with. China, he said, I couldn't even find China on a map. I'm not doing any business in China. No, our phone app doesn't trace people. These are lies. Why wasn't he charged? This is a game. The censorship of non-Trump supporters is a major issue in 2020. You now see them finally, and I predicted this, beginning to censor or comment on the president's tweets. Relying on the Washington Post to say that there is no ballot fraud in a mail-in election, that's like asking Jack the Ripper to massage your neck. It's ridiculous. It's a joke. Let's be clear. Virtually nothing reported by the Washington Post is either true or accurate. This one reporter, Roz Helderman, is one of the great fiction writers of all time. So nothing written by that newspaper can be relied upon. It's not a news organization. It's a propaganda organ. There's no evidence that outside elements are ginning up these riots. I'm not quoting their headline exactly, but I think it's pretty close. No, that's wrong. That's false. That's not true. That's not news. That's crap.
Roger, when it comes down to Dennis Prager, are you familiar with Dennis Prager of Prager University?
Yes.
So the whole topic about censorship and YouTube and what's taking place and videos being taken down. I was speaking to them about the fact that, what really happened. And I pulled up the lawsuit and I read the whole thing, where eventually it was dismissed and they didn't really consider it because there's a difference between freedom of speech by the government versus freedom of speech of what you can say on a company, private enterprise. They can choose to take whatever they want to take down or whatever they don't want to take down. So if that's the case, can YouTube do or Twitter do or Facebook do anything they want to do? Because Zuck took a different approach where Zuck said, I don't think if Facebook is not in the fact-checking business. He said this last week on Fox, if you saw that. So what is your opinion on censorship on what YouTube can and can't do?
The phone company is a privately owned company. but they're regulated. I mean, if you're serving the public, I think you could be regulated. As a conservative, I don't like regulation, generally speaking. But if that's the only way we can ensure fair access, I believe caveat emptor, let the consumer decide what he or she believes or what he or she wants to read. I got a message from a guy this morning who simply put up a meme on Instagram that said, "Pardon Roger Stone." And he was deplatformed like that. I've been on Facebook for a long time. My Facebook page for Stone Cold Truth, which is my website where I post political opinion, has 165 or 150,000 followers. During the election, if I posted something I wrote, it would get 600, 700, 1,000 shares. It would get literally thousands of readings. Now I get 3, 4, 7. Do you really think we're that stupid? I mean, these things are being manipulated at the back end through shadow banning and so on. Has to be stopped.
I got 2 things.
Everybody should have fair access to the internet. I don't care if you're a socialist or a progressive or a vegetarian. It doesn't matter to me. Let the people decide what they want to read, what they want to believe.
By the way, it's so interesting listening to you and seeing how similar of a style of communication you and President Trump have on how you guys speak. If I can put him over here and watch you, it's such similarities. By the way, Stone's rules. Let's wrap this up. We'll do speed run and we'll be done with this interview here. So Stone's rules, I'll go through 10 of them, and you tell me out of these 10, which of them are by far your favorite and most important one. Number one, it is better.
It's going to be very hard. Go ahead.
It's going to be very hard. I'm curious to know what you're going to say. It is better to be infamous than not to be famous at all. That's rule number one. Number two, past is prologue. Okay, now you add an adjective to it, but past is prologue. Number three, attack, never defend. Number four, business is business. Number five, only thing worse in politics than being wrong is being boring. You talked about it earlier. Number six, reinvent yourself. Number seven, nothing is on the level. Number eight, think big, be big. Number nine, hate is more powerful motivator than love. And number 10, to win, you must do everything. Which one do you think is the most important one?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that most of those are written within the context of a political campaign. Now, some of them are transferable to life overall, but they're all important in their own way. I could not really pick one rule over another because they're interconnected. They all work together. My book, Stone's Rules, was not written for conservatives or Republicans or Christians. It was written for everybody. Doesn't matter whether you're in entertainment or tech or agriculture or on Wall Street. This is a book that I think can benefit everybody. These are the simple lessons that I have learned as a warrior with 40 years in the arena. And I think they work for everybody, men and women. Now, there's some style tips in there for men that won't work for women. But beyond that, these are just rules of the road. It's like a handbook. I commend it to anybody who wants to succeed. How do I get through my current ordeal and my struggle with out of control federal prosecutors? By following the rules in this book, which is probably the second greatest book ever written after the Bible.
Love your humility. It's a the big strength of yours. It's very obvious. By the way, how many of those rules apply to business? How many of those apply to?
A lot of them, I think, apply to business. It tells you how to budget an internet media campaign is in there. There's a lot of practical advice in there as well as philosophical advice. By the way, this is not the best book I've written. That was a joke.
I'm gonna put the links below for your Lyndon Johnson book and some of the other books that you talk about. We'll put the links below. One thing I wonder about you is you've come up and it's attack, never defend. It's a very cutthroat, super competitive. You were not worried about stepping on anybody as long as you want. Do you think right now, looking back, I've sat with Ditka and I wonder how Ditka processed with when he was coming up, Ditka doing his interviews from the Bears as a, coach, he would just call everybody out and he challenged people and it's pretty strong opinions. And even with the Last Dance documentary with Michael, you're seeing how he was and how he pushed his people, challenged people, pissed a lot of people off. On your way up in politics, you've created a lot of enemies, many of them, many enemies. Do you
Because
think,
somebody wins and somebody loses. That's the way politics works.
yeah, but you're cutthroat, meaning you had no sympathy for beating everybody. I mean, you're a hyper.
No, I think that's unfair. Here's what I'm trying to say when I say attack and attack. In any campaign, the candidate who dominates the dialogue from the beginning to the end will win. You have to force the other person to talk about what you want to talk about. If you end up talking about what they want to talk about, you will lose. So by being aggressive, by going on the attack, by delineating the agenda and what the campaign is going to be about, you will win. That means you have to draw first blood. You have to lay down the predicate for any campaign. A campaign on defense is losing votes. A campaign that is explaining is losing votes. A campaign that has no forward motion is losing votes. Politics is motion. That's one of the rules in the book. You have to create the perception that your campaign is gaining steam, that you are moving forward, that you are attracting supporters. Perception is reality. It's your job to create that perception, and you create it by taking the initiative. That is what I'm trying to say in that rule. Yeah, when you outsmart the other guys, you make enemies. Tom Kean was the governor of New Jersey. He's a great man. He ran in a primary with 9 opponents, and some of them were very substantial, established politicians with long records of distinguished public service. And he was a former leader of the state house. He won. They lost. I had 1 friend and 8 enemies. It's the way it is.
So you don't think that's the reason why you have a lot of people right now that are wanting to take you down? You don't think because you've created so many different enemies that have teamed up together to say, now it's our turn. Let's get even with Roger.
Well, I'm certainly that there are some who have revenge as a motive. Look, I wrote a book, The Bush Crime Family, and I wrote a book, The Clintons' War on Women. I'm an equal opportunity truth teller, and I'll say things that aren't popular. You know, Jeffrey Epstein's been in the news a great deal over the last year. If you go to my book, The Clintons' War on Women, the longest chapter is on Jeffrey Epstein, and every single thing you have learned in the last year was written back in 2016. Bill's 28 trips on the Lolita Express, Bill's 17, I think is the right number, visits to Epstein's pedophile island, the fact that George Mitchell and Bill Richardson and others were enjoying the company of underage children. It's all in my book, but the mainstream media didn't cover my book. So now that it was covered, really because the courageous reporting of an investigative reporter with the Miami Herald, a woman named Brown, who did an amazing job of doggedly staying on this case because she knew something wasn't right. Now everybody knows, but back then nobody knew. It's all in my book.
Have you watched the docuseries of Jeffrey Epstein or no? You haven't gone through it? Okay. So let's do speed round. Roger, I'll give you a name. Tell me one word that comes to your mind. One word that comes to your mind. John Davis Lodge.
The smarter of the 2 Lodge brothers. He was Henry Cabot Lodge's brother. One of my mentors.
President
actor, diplomat, congressman, governor. Very successful actor.
President Trump.
Courageous, ballsy.
Hillary Clinton.
Criminal.
Joe Biden.
Racist.
Scary Moochie.
Nice guy.
Kushner.
I saw him wearing a suit. I said, "Hey, Mooch, that's a great looking suit. What does it cost in a man's size?"
Kushner.
I like what he's done on criminal justice. I think he's done a great job.
Robert Mueller.
Befuddled, not all there. A cover-up artist for the deep state. Anthrax, 9/11, it's all there.
Michael Flynn.
A great American patriot, the only guy in America that I can think of who's been screwed worse than I have.
James Comey.
Epically corrupt, pompous, and I wonder why he hasn't been charged and I have.
Giuliani.
The greatest mayor New York City ever had, a straight shooter, and a friend.
Lewandowski.
I'm softening on this. You know, he and I were pretty bitter enemies, We have a different approach, but I like the fact that he has the courage to defend the president at all places.
Machiavelli.
I've read his book many times, and if you read Stone's rules, a number of my rules are with acknowledgement based on his.
Paul Manafort.
Paul Manafort is complicated, a strategic genius when it comes to convention politics. I don't recommend his business practices.
Richard Nixon.
Resilient, persistent, the greatest comeback in American history.
Charles Black.
A savvy Washington operator.
Jim Messina. Jim Messina. You don't know that name?
I'm not
Campaign
sure who that is.
Ross Perot.
A trailblazer. People forget the fact that he actually led both Bush and Gore for some period of time in that election, proving that if you had enough money, a third-party candidate could win. An early precursor to Trump in the sense that a businessman running for president. First time that's ever gotten any real traction. I know these aren't one-word answers, but it's tough.
All good. Mark Cuban.
I like him. He's audacious. He's a businessman like Trump. I never quite understand where he stands because sometimes he's pro-Trump, sometimes he's critical, but he's always interesting. I like watching him.
George Soros.
Evil, the personification of evil.
Elliot Spitzer.
A hypocrite, a man who was prosecuting guys for seeing prostitutes while he himself was seeing prostitutes.
Andrew Cuomo.
Tough, Nixonian in many ways, unforgiving, politically talented, kind of ruthless.
Has a shot for presidency?
It's very hard to say. I mean, because they've delayed some of these late primaries, it's not inconceivable that Biden could get to the convention with not enough votes to go over the top on the first ballot. If Biden were to fall short on the first ballot, he won't be the nominee. Somebody else will.
2024, dude. Does he have a shot in 2024, Cuomo?
Probably. He's got to get reelected governor. The history on that is not good. People who've gone for the fourth term in New York have not historically fared well in the past.
Nancy Pelosi.
Frozen face. What's wrong with her face?
Roy Cohen.
Complicated, vicious, sentimental, extraordinarily loyal, photographic memory, tough as nails.
And last but not least, Roger Stone, one word.
A guy who always did his best and a fighter who will never quit.
How ugly are these this year's campaign going to be, this presidential campaign this year? How ugly will it get?
It'll be very ugly, but there has to be a context. When Lincoln ran, they had handbills posted that said that he had fathered a black child, and they handed them out. Today, we use the internet and television, but it's just as vicious. Politics in America is a contact sport. It always has been. It always will be. So I don't expect it to be any more vicious than the one 4 years ago and the one 4 years before that and the one 4 years before that on through our history. The only thing that's changed is our technological capability to deliver the message.
Just change the game. Social media is a completely changed the game. Roger, we're going to put the links to all your books below, and I'm going to put the link to the GoFundMe website you were talking about as well. We'll put that link below as well. Thank you so much for coming and visiting us on Valuetainment and being a guest.
I'm glad to be here, and thanks to my friend Josh Feuerstein for putting us together. This has been a great opportunity because, as I say, I have a lot to say.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So, it's not often you see a long-form interview taking place with Roger Stone, especially right now after him being indicted. I think this is the first long-form, if not the longest interview he's done for a couple hours, where we talk about a broad of issues, his relationship with Trump, people he's worked with in the past, the Stone Rule, all these other things that we discussed. I want to hear your thoughts on what you took away from today's interview. Click below and comment on what you took away, as well as if you watch this interview and you like the topic, you like the dialogue. I have two other interviews I want you to watch. One of them is with Bernard Kerik, who was the former chief of the police department in New York, NYPD, and he had a very, very strong reputation at a time when they cleaned the streets of New York. Or the other interview would be with Ron Paul. Ron Paul talks about how he came about his philosophies with politics. If you've not watched this one, click over here. If you've not watched the Bernard Kerik one, click on that one. And if you've not subscribed to the channel, please do so. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.